In the world of code, programmers heavily rely on iterating through blocks of code that need to be executed with different data multiple times. This same concept applies to flowgramming and requires two important components. The first is the function card that calls another flow, such as the iterative for each function card that you'll remember from a previous lesson. And the second is child flows, which is what we're going to learn about right now. Simply put, a child flow is a flow that is called by another flow. A parent flow is the term used for the flow that calls a child flow. Parent flows are always the flows that make the call, and child flows are always the flows that receive the call. This call always initiates the child flow, presuming the child flow has been activated and its connections were correctly established. These terms are used to denote a relative hierarchy, kind of like a family tree for your flows. Because child flows are directly dependent on the parent flows that call them. They do not count toward your active flow limit. However, they are still flows and must be activated before other flows can call them. Child flows are called by using the flow control functions. Those include call flow async, and iterative functions for lists like map and for each. You'll use functions like for each when the parent flow needs to call the child flow to perform an operation but doesn't need to use any of the results. The parent flow may still continue to perform additional actions after calling the child flow, but will remain unaware of the result. Functions like map, on the other hand, take the results of the child flows so that they can be used in the parent flow. When you want to use the map function, you'll likely discover you have more than one option, and it's important to know which one to use. Each map function will be associated with its input data type, which you can find on the right side of the panel. This also represents the function category for the function card, meaning you'll find it in that section in the panel when browsing. These map functions allow you to take the contents of a list or an object, change those contents using a child flow, and then map the results to a new list or object. First, you can use the map function to call a child flow. Provide it with an existing list, process that list, and create a new list out of the processed data. You can process lists of any data type, including lists of objects. The other map function cards allow you to do the same with the contents of a single object, mapping the results to either a new list or a new object. As we've discussed in previous lessons, it's important to plan out your flows before beginning to build them out in the Workflows console. Planning makes it much easier to recognize when you'll want to use a child flow and when you won't. Up until now, we have primarily focused on flows that don't call upon child flows. When called, these self-contained flows perform an action, or a series of actions, on the provided data just a single time. Of course, the flow will likely run more than a single time, but it will receive and process new data each time it runs. For example, a flow that runs every time a new contact is added to a spreadsheet or database would process contact data for a single contact each time it runs. However, sometimes you'll need to design a flow to work with more than one data record, like if you scheduled a flow to run every Friday evening to search for and acquire all the new contacts at once. In this situation, you'd have more than one contact to process, and would use a child flow to process each one individually. The parent flow would simply break the list of contacts down into individual items and send each item to the child flow. When using a map function, the child flow would provide the results to the parent flow for further processing. When using a for each function, on the other hand, the child flow would simply process each contact as designed, but it would not return any of the results to the parent flow. When using child flows to process multiple items, there are a few things you'll need to keep in mind. First, you'll need to set up your inputs and outputs in both your parent and child flow. As you know, the parent flow will have a function that calls the child flow. If this function is iterative like the map function, you'll need to specify the list or object to break down into individual items that will be sent to the child flow. Next, you'll set the child flow you want and click Choose. You can also click the icon on the right side of each child flow to open the child flow in a new window, so you can easily move back and forth between parent and child flows while working. If you haven't created the child flow already, you can create a new one through this panel as well. If you're creating a new child flow, remember that you always have to create a child flow event card as a starting point. Once you have this card, you'll want to add any inputs you'll need to pass necessary data to this child flow for processing. You can create as many inputs as you like and set their names so that they are easily identified. Also, make sure to set the data types of these inputs correctly, or your child flow will likely result in errors. The data types for each input should match the data types of the output values in the parent flow. In the example on your screen, you can see that the parent flow is sending data from a list of objects, so we'll want the child flow to expect a list of objects as an input. Although this example shows matched child inputs and parent outputs, this doesn't happen automatically. After adding the inputs you want in your child flow, you'll need to save the child flow and reload the parent flow for the new inputs to appear. If you still do not see the new inputs, try choosing the child flow again, using the function card that calls it. Once your inputs are visible, specify the data you want to pass to each input and set its data type. Once you have your parent flow's outputs matching your child flow's inputs, make sure to save your parent flow as well. This is also a good time to check and make sure you haven't missed anything that might cause an error. Even if you saved your parent and child flows successfully without the Workflows console notifying you of a problem, it's still possible that you have an inexplicit error that could cause problems and confusion later on. Quickly checking your work can help you catch something you might have overlooked, or a small mistake that you made before you move on, so that you don't struggle to locate the problem later. With your setup complete and checked for issues, there's at least one more thing you need to do in your child flow: turn it on. If you don't turn on your child flow, then the parent will not be able to call it. Of course, if you haven't finished creating all the cards in your child flow yet, you'll need to do that first. Building out the steps in a child flow works in the same manner as any other flow. However, there are some small details you'll want to know about. First, if your child flow receives a list as an input, and you want to iterate through each item in that list, you'll need to set that up. In the example on your screen, you can see that the child flow event card offers more information beyond the inputs you created. You'll find the unique execution ID that's generated each time the flow is called, any errors that may occur when calling the child flow, the parent flow caller of the child flow, and the index. The caller is a data object that contains information about the parent flow that called the child flow, and it can be very useful if you use the same child flow with multiple parents and need to use branching function cards to change the behavior of the child flow based on its caller. We don't need that information right now, but it's a good thing to know about for later. What we do need right now is the index, which contains the number representing the current position in the list. For example, when processing the first item in the list, the index will be set to 0. When moving on to the second, the index will increment to 1. This counting process continues until the last item of the list is reached, presuming no errors occur during the process. When creating a child flow that iterates through each item in a list, we need to use the index to specify which list item to process. To do this, we can employ the function card and set it to extract the item from the input list that matches the index's current position. Once you've set this up, you'll have extracted a single piece of data, and work with it like you would in any self-contained flow. Add your actions, manipulate the data, and decide what to do with it when each step has been completed successfully. For example, you might want to add a new row in a spreadsheet or send an email for each item processed. If the parent function doesn't need to know the results to continue its work, you can consider your child flow complete and turn it on. However, when using a function card like map that expects a response from the child flow, you'll need to end your child flow with a return card. You'll find this card in the flow control category, and you can set it up by dragging the individual output fields you want to send back to the parent flow. In most cases, you'll want to send back any data processed by the child flow. With the return card in place, you're ready to turn on your child flow. With your parent and child flows complete, run a test to make sure everything works as expected. Check the output of the parent flows test to make sure this is the case. You won't see the flow history of the child flow in this case, but you can open the child flow and visit its history to inspect it for issues. You may find an explicit error, but in some cases, it may appear as if everything worked correctly when you got a result you didn't want. Usually this sort of problem occurs when data types don't match up, but in any case, you should inspect the output in each step of the process to try and discover the root of the problem. You can also test individual cards in the child flow and manually specify your own input data. This will allow you to make small changes to the input to see if those changes solve your issue. Of course, whenever you're struggling to figure out what to do, remember that you can click the Help button on any card to open its help page. If you need general help with child flows, the help button on the child flow event card, as well as the one on the function card that called it, are a good place to start. Now you have a general understanding of how child flows work, when you should use them, and how to create them. Keep this information in mind when flowgramming so you never miss an opportunity to build more efficient flows with reusable modular components.